In 2009, a world-renowned scientist published a theory so radical, it claimed
everything that you see out there, every particle, depends on the observer for their very properties. And it turns out that life and consciousness are absolutely essential to reality. So that it's clear that without an observer, you could not actually have existence, you could not have reality.
His name is Dr. Robert Lanza.
Robert Lanza was called by the New York Times one of the 3 most important scientists alive today. Just to give you an idea of the caliber of our next presenter.
He cloned endangered animals, advanced stem cell science, and gained global recognition, until he said something that made science go quiet.
So I've come to conclusions that would shock many of my colleagues and predecessors. Space and time are tools of our mind. Experiment after experiment shows that not a single particle out there exists with real properties until it's observed.
Now, pay attention, because what you're about to hear challenges the most basic thing you believe about reality. He claims that everything about the universe is backwards. Consciousness doesn't come from the brain. The brain and everything in space and time comes from consciousness. Stay with me, because this isn't science fiction. It's grounded in quantum mechanics, biology, and decades of research. Let's break this down. Imagine you're looking at a tree. You assume it's just there, whether or not you're looking at it. That's how we've been taught to see the world. But quantum experiments, like the famous double-slit experiment, suggest something strange. Until a conscious observer checks, particles don't have defined positions. They exist in a state of probability. In other words, they're not real until you observe them. So what does that mean? It means the universe might not exist without you. And that flips everything upside down. This is where things start to shift. The idea that life doesn't exist within the universe exists within life. Consciousness isn't some side effect of atoms. It's the very fabric holding it all together.
So take the undeniable logic that your kitchen is always present. You think that its contents assume its familiar shapes and colors whether or not you're in it. But consider, the shapes, colors, and forms known as your kitchen are seen because the particles of light from the overhead bulb bounce off the various objects and then interact with your brain through a complex set of retinal and neural intermediates. But on its own, light doesn't have any color, nor any brightness, nor any visual characteristics at all. It's merely an electrical and electromagnetic phenomenon. So you might think that the kitchen was there in your absence, but unquestionably, the reality is that nothing remotely resembling what you perceive as your kitchen could possibly be there without your consciousness interacting with it. Quantum physics comes at it from a much hotter angle and arrives at the same conclusion. So at night, you click your lights off and you leave for the bedroom. And of course the kitchen is there unseen all through the night, right? So in fact, the refrigerator, it turns out, the stove, and everything in your kitchen are composed of a shivering swarm of energy. And the results of quantum physics, such as the two-hole experiment and others, tell us that not a single one of those particles in any of those objects actually exists in a definite space until you observe them. Rather, they exist in a range of probabilities, waves of probability. So outside of that fact, there's really nothing there. They're just statistical probabilities of particles existing in certain locations. So if they aren't being observed, they can't be thought of as having any real existence, either duration or position in space. So it's only in the presence of the observer, that is when you go back and get a drink of water, that the mind actually sets the scaffolding of these particles in place.
Robert Lanza isn't a random voice from the internet. He's been named among Time magazine's 100 most influential people. He's a pioneer in cloning endangered species, helping advance stem cell therapies, and has published in prestigious journals like Nature and The Lancet. But his most controversial claim? That death, as we understand it, doesn't actually exist. And if that's true, then when your body stops working, your awareness doesn't disappear. It shifts. And that's where things get even more unbelievable. Lanza's perspective is simple, but radical. Consciousness doesn't end when your body dies. Instead, it continues outside of space and time, because it was never confined to the brain in the first place. To understand this, we need to look at what physics has been telling us for over a century. In Einstein's theory of relativity, time is not a fixed arrow. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously. Your death, in that sense, is just a coordinate in a much bigger structure. From a timeless perspective, there is no true before or after. Quantum physics goes even further. The observer effect shows that particles behave differently when being watched. It's as if consciousness itself activates reality. So, if consciousness isn't produced by matter, but instead shapes it, then where does it go when the body shuts down? Here's where it gets fascinating. Lanza explains that what we call death is simply the end of a biological function, not the end of awareness. Your experience doesn't stop. It just detaches from the physical structure, just like a TV signal continues even after the receiver breaks. And this idea isn't new. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant and modern physicists like John Wheeler have said similar things, that space and time are tools of the mind, not external realities. According to Lanza, reality is a process that involves your consciousness at every level. Even time and space are constructs your mind uses to organize information, and when the body dies, those tools fall away, but you don't. Instead of fading into nothing, your awareness shifts into another framework, one not bound by the rules we think are universal. And before you dismiss that as spiritual fluff, remember, mainstream science still can't explain how consciousness arises from brain matter. There's no biological mechanism that bridges the gap between neurons firing and the experience of being.
There's nothing in physics that can explain, as you've already heard over and over, how a group of molecules in the brain creates consciousness. So the beauty of the sunset, the taste of a delicious meal, these are all mysteries to science, how we subjectively feel that.
So maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of what happens when we die, maybe we should be asking, what is this place we're experiencing, and who's really doing the experiencing? Because if consciousness isn't local, then death might not be a wall, it might be a doorway. Here's where things take a turn most people never see coming. If consciousness exists outside of time and space, then reality as we experience it could be just one version among many. Not because of sci-fi multiverses, but because consciousness may be constantly selecting outcomes from a sea of quantum possibilities. Think of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, proposed by physicist Hugh Everett in the 1950s. It suggests that every time a decision is made or a particle takes one path over another, alternate realities branch off.
Now, we've never thought that we were in a superposition, right? No one ever feels like that's what they've seen. So the inventors of quantum mechanics said, well, we're going to pick one of those possible places. You saw it here and the electron was there, and say that's real. What the many worlds version of quantum mechanics says, actually, they're all real, but they can't talk to each other. So before you did the observation, there was one world, the electron was spread out and you were in your state. After, there are many, many worlds, and in each one of those worlds, the electron was in one particular position, and that is where you saw it.
In that framework, your consciousness could, theoretically, continue in one of those branches after death. Not reincarnation, not heaven or hell, but a shift, a continuation in a new configuration of reality, selected and sustained by awareness. Lanza doesn't claim to know exactly what that looks like. He only insists that death is not the end of consciousness, because consciousness is not confined to physical matter, and that's not as outrageous as it sounds. Let's go back to biology for a moment. Your brain processes information electrochemically, but the awareness of that information, the voice in your head, the sense of self, is not physical. You can't touch a thought. You can't weigh a feeling. Yet we know they're real because we experience them directly. So what if that inner world isn't a side effect of biology, but the source of it? Lanza points to experiments where people in near-death states reported vivid consciousness, even when their brains showed zero electrical activity. Their memories were sharp, emotions clear, details precise. Some even recalled conversations happening in the room while they were clinically dead.
What we're beginning to demonstrate is that actually, contrary to our perceptions, consciousness does not become annihilated just because a person has just died. And in fact, consciousness appears to continue at least in the first period, the early period of death, the first minutes or hours after death. Beyond that, of course, we can't study because that's the extent that we can get to. I don't know what will happen in the future, but certainly during the time when the brain is shut down and flatlined, the entity of consciousness does not get lost.
This raises a powerful question. If the brain is off, how is the mind still on? The answer, according to biocentrism, is that the brain isn't generating consciousness, it's filtering it, like a radio that tunes into a signal that was always there. And when the brain stops, the signal doesn't. It just stops coming through that channel. So death might not be a loss, but a release from the illusion that this physical form was ever the full story. Let's look at what the science actually says, because as strange as these ideas sound, they're backed by real-world data that's hard to ignore. Over the last 2 decades, researchers like Dr. Sam Parnia have studied hundreds of cases where people were clinically dead. No heartbeat, no brain activity, yet somehow they were still aware. Their memories during these periods weren't vague dreams. They were detailed, consistent, sometimes even verifiable.
Among the group who survived, what we found is a breadth of consciousness and recollection. So 39% of people reported broad perceptions and memories. These were not necessarily being able to recall specific events, but they felt that they had been conscious or had specific memories. If you then broke this down further, 20% of the group who survived had a transcendent experience regarding their cardiac arrest. 7% of these, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, 7% of the experiences were more compatible with CPR-induced consciousness. You'll see what I mean in a moment with that. 7% had perceptions of auditory awareness and hearing different things, discussions, and 3.5% had visual awareness.
In one case, a man described exact medical procedures being done on his body, while his brain showed no signs of consciousness. Monitors confirmed that brain activity had flatlined, and yet the awareness remained. That shouldn't be possible. Another study, led by Dr. Bruce Grayson, one of the most respected figures in near-death research, found that many people who had NDEs came back with vivid experiences that changed their entire worldview. Common themes included a sense of floating outside the body, observing doctors working on them, or traveling through light into another space altogether. And here's the part that breaks every rule we thought we understood. In many of these cases, patients describe things they couldn't possibly have known, like conversations in another room or visual details they were never physically present to see.
Yeah, I grew up in a scientific household, and we never had any thought about anything spiritual or non-physical. My first week or two into my residency, I was confronted by a patient who was unconscious. I couldn't talk with her. She was totally out cold, so I talked to her roommate who had brought her in a different room, and then came back and saw the patient. She was still unconscious. I had her admitted to the intensive care unit, and when I saw her the next morning, I went in to introduce myself, and she said, I know who you are. I remember you from last night. And that kind of blew me away. I didn't know what she was talking about. She proceeded to tell me about the conversation I had with her roommate, and including intimate details, and I didn't know what to make of that.
If consciousness were purely a brain function, all of this should be impossible. But it keeps happening. Some scientists argue it's just random brain activity in a dying mind. But that explanation collapses when you see clear awareness during periods when the brain shows no activity at all. So the question is no longer, do these experiences happen? The evidence is overwhelming. The real question is, what do they mean? And that's where Lanza's framework fits perfectly. Biocentrism doesn't just accommodate these anomalies, it predicts them. If the mind isn't confined to the body and reality is observer-dependent, then death wouldn't stop awareness. It would simply shift the point of observation. And suddenly, all these scattered cases and bizarre experiences aren't random anymore. They're part of a bigger pattern. A pattern that suggests our understanding of death might be completely wrong. If these cases were rare, maybe we could ignore them, but they're not. In fact, across cultures, ages, religions, even among people with no belief in an afterlife, the same pattern keeps showing up. Awareness continues after clinical death. Details are recalled accurately, and the experience often feels more real than waking life. That's not just strange, it's statistically significant. Studies by institutions like NYU Langone, University of Virginia, and the Netherlands Radboud University all point to the same core insight. Consciousness doesn't behave the way materialist science says it should. It's not confined to the brain. It doesn't shut off like a light switch. And it's not just near-death experiences. People under deep anesthesia, where brain activity is heavily suppressed, sometimes report vivid awareness. In rare cases of terminal lucidity, Alzheimer's patients who hadn't spoken in years suddenly became fully coherent moments before death. They recognize loved ones, they speak clearly, then they pass.
Well, we did a literature search and found about 80 cases in the literature of the past 100 years. And in the last decade, there's been a lot of research into this phenomenon. And it's mostly being done in Alzheimer's research units. But we also see it with brain tumors, with abscesses, with chronic schizophrenics, with a variety of cases in which the brain seems to be not functioning for a long period of time. And then shortly before death, they become completely lucid again. Recognize people, start carrying on coherent conversations, and we don't really know how to explain this at this point.
If the brain is deteriorated, how is this possible? It all points in one direction. The mind is not the machine. It's something else. This is exactly what thinkers like physicist Max Planck hinted at over a century ago. He said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. Everything else derives from it, not the other way around." So why are we still acting like consciousness is a byproduct of the brain? Because our entire model of reality, our science, medicine, even our sense of identity is built on the materialist assumption that only what we can see, touch, or measure is real. But the data refuses to stay quiet, and when you put it all together, a new picture starts to form. One where death isn't the end, one where reality is shaped from the inside out, one where the thing you call you has never been a body. It's always been an observer, an experiencer, a presence that can't be measured by instruments because it's the source of measurement itself. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Here's where it all comes together. In the 1980s, two scientists working in separate fields, David Bohm, a quantum physicist, and Karl Pribram, a neuroscientist, arrived at the same shocking conclusion. Both the universe and the human brain appear to function like holograms. A hologram is a 3D image encoded in a 2D surface. But here's the mind-blowing part. Every part of a hologram contains the whole, cut into pieces, and each fragment still contains the entire image. Bohm believed that what we see as reality is just the projection of a deeper hidden order he called the implicate order, a field beyond space and time where everything is connected. What we perceive as separate objects, people, and events are just fragments unfolding from that deeper source.
We are internally related to everything, not externally related. Consciousness is an internal relationship to the whole. We take in the whole and we act toward the whole. And that internal, whatever we have taken in, determines basically what we are.
Pribram, working on how memories are stored in the brain, discovered something equally strange. Our brains don't seem to store memories in fixed locations like files in a cabinet. Instead, memory behaves holographically, distributed, non-local, and interference-based, just like a hologram. Together, their findings suggested something radical, that reality might not be out there. What we see as the external world could be a projection emerging from a deeper field of consciousness, an interconnected matrix where space and time are just illusions layered on top. And this explains why so many near-death experiences and altered states report the same thing: a sense of oneness, timelessness, and a collapse of the boundary between self and world. Because maybe when the body dies, the projection ends, but the source, the field behind it all, remains. You, still aware, still present. The idea that death is the end only makes sense in a world where reality is separate, linear, and material. But if the universe is holographic, if consciousness is primary, then death isn't a disappearance. It's a return to the place behind the illusion, to the field that creates all things, to the source that was never separate from you. And here's something strange. Many people say they've seen repeating numbers everywhere: 1111, 1212, 444, 1616, almost like little glitches in the code of reality, signals from something deeper, maybe even from that field behind the projection. Anyway, these synchronicities are a whole other rabbit hole we'll explore in a future video. Quick side note, if you're into numerology, I recommend trying a free numerology reading on this website. It's simple but surprisingly accurate, and it helped me make sense of a few patterns I couldn't explain before. I'll leave a link in the description. And the craziest part? Some scientists think we've already caught glimpses of it. If death is just the end of a projection, and if space is not truly separate, then there's one more illusion we have to confront: time. Einstein once said the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. According to his theory of relativity, all moments in time already exist. Past and future aren't gone or yet to happen. They're just coordinates, like different places on a map. In this model, your birth, your best memory, your final breath, they're all still there. The flow of time is something you experience, but it doesn't exist on its own. It's a byproduct of consciousness moving through events. And if that's true, then death doesn't mark the end of you. It marks the end of this particular experience of linear time. Here's where things get even more surreal. Dr. Robert Lanza takes this further. If space and time are just tools your consciousness uses to decode the universe, then you've never actually been in time. You've only been experiencing snapshots of it, like frames in a film. And death? That's just the point where the film reel shifts. Your awareness, never disappears. You just stop experiencing this particular storyline. And this explains why so many near-death experiences report a strange sense of timelessness, where everything happens at once and time has no meaning. Because maybe outside this projection, time doesn't exist. So what happens when we die? Maybe nothing ends. Maybe we just exit the illusion of linear time and return to a state where everything, every moment, every possibility exists all at once. And now that you've seen this, how can you ever look at life the same way again? Because if space is an illusion, if time is an illusion, and if death is just a transition, then maybe the biggest illusion of all is that you were ever separate from the universe in the first place. That's it for today's video. If this gave you a new perspective, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Feel free to share it with someone who's been asking the same questions. And as always, thanks for watching.